Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the IDRiM podcast. Today we'll be carrying on with our conversation with Professor Renn and Dr. Liu about Polycrisis. And where we're going to pick up from is very much talking about the art of communication in crisis and how do we communicate in events of polycrisis. We hope you enjoy today's episode. So I actually want to go back to something you mentioned, but also links into the misinformation bit, and it's the communication of polycrisis. And you mentioned that in Germany, during the COVID-19 pandemic, that the perception that the government didn't know what it was doing after like October because of all this. Is this when we have a polycrisis? Is there actually a way that we could communicate? These different trade-offs, because I think that we are quite limited on how we can view crisis, and we're quite multiple. We can't view many dimensions of crisis. That's the trade-off bits as well. So is there any way that we can just simplify the communication?
Yeah, well, let me first say, we have specific challenges of communication, and we're very keen on making those challenges clear in the paper. The first one is that, we're dealing with really stochastic world in which, things are not deterministic. It's not if A, then B, and if not A, then not B. People are used to that. It's very clear. That's something that can deal with. It's much more difficult to deal with if, say, if A, then there's a probability of B, but there's also a probability of C and D, but E is out of the question. And that is much more difficult. You can see it with very simple examples like smoking. If you're smoking, you always are the exception, and you say, oh, not me, it's everybody else. If you're a non-smoker, you're always the most sensitive people in the world, the most sensitive person in the world. You say, oh, one cigarette will kill me. So in a sense is, they all have a feeling of what we call the Gaussian normal distribution, but the people who want others to change are on the left side. We are the most sensitive ones, and the people who are supposed to change are on the right side and say, oh, it doesn't matter to me, and that makes it very difficult communication. We can see, and we see this very, very often. Smoking was an example, which was much easier, but with the pandemic, vaccination, people had a hard time understanding that if they were vaccinated, they could still get sick. It was just the probability was lower. And severe consequences were much lower. And of course, there was also the risk of the vaccination itself. And how do you compare that risk with the risk of being infected? And that gets complex, and that people got really confused about it. And that is very difficult to communicate. The second point, which is very difficult in terms of, is that very often it's counterintuitive. And that's why all these conspiracy theories are so popular, because they're so plausible in a sense, although they're totally, out of the question, they're wrong and absurd, but nevertheless, the story is kind of plausible. And but with a lot of complex systems, it's not plausible. If I drive a car here in Germany and I say, well, that may have an impact on a flood in Bangladesh, well, that's not plausible. It seems to be far-fetched, and that's a good word, far-fetched. It's far. It's not something closely related to what I experience. And so communication needs to get over that plausibility trap. And the third thing, which I think it's extremely difficult, is that a lot of these systemic risks have a latency period, and they may have thresholds or even tipping points. And that's totally opposed to our normal learning method. We learn by trial and error. And also the economy is based on trial and error. If you go bankrupt, if you don't have the right product. But if you have tipping points, you get positive feedback all the time until you reach the tipping point, and then it's too late. And that's very difficult then to restore the original situation. So you have to anticipate something that has not happened. And that, again, is against most what people would say. And that's what we can see all the global climate changes, that people say, oh, it's not that bad. Yeah, it's getting warmer, we have some more fires and this, but, and they underestimate that we're reaching tipping points, and that after these tipping points are reached, it's really getting much worse. And so that's a third major challenge. And what we've said in the paper was, yes, traditional methods of communication may not work here. Specifically, the traditional scientific methods of giving them all kinds of models and giving them figures, saying, okay, now we're here, and then if you go up this way, it's going to get worse. People say, sure, yes, and then it. What we really do need are very good narratives, and I know that's a very fashionable word, but it's make people part of a story in which they can feel what it means to, for example, exceed tipping points, how they would be affected, and make it so alive that people are always like a movie, say, oh wow, if that's going to happen to me, no, then I need to do something. So that, I think, is very important, to put them into a narrative and to make sure that they understand what will happen, so that anticipation becomes more real. It's not something totally hypothetical. And I think that's an important element of communication. We do this, and also, to teach people early about stochastic thinking. Again, that's something which is very difficult to do, but that also is more a goal for education. But also we can have, let's say, simple examples, like the smoking example, where everybody said, oh, yeah, I know this. The smokers always think they're safe, and the non-smokers always think they're more sensitive. And we can then put that into the context of polycrisis. So, yeah, there are quite a few challenges, but I think we also have means to deal with them.
And I just wanted to, jump in here and, talk about more about the crisis of communication, polycrisis and communication, climate. So there are two other ones, like you talk about, where communication hasn't gone through very well. So I just literally wrote a paper literally talking about local perceptions of climate and the way that people see climate as a faraway issue and not a local issue, and we haven't tackled the local element yet. So that's one of the reasons why people don't think it's a big issue, because because it's such a creeping disaster, they don't see it in their community as as broadly. So, and one of the other things is that in terms of that paper, it also said that people use climate change as a way to understand bigger events. So if they see a big flood, perception goes up, but then it comes back down again. And they're using it as a way of trying to explain a disaster rather than actually that this is a problem. It's just used as a disaster. The other one is the story of how the UK has tried to improve its environmental emissions and reduce its emissions. And one of them, we put a lot of attention, in particular in the 90s and early 2000s, on transportation and getting people to become more fuel efficient, to walk more. And one of the ways we did it was fuel duty, and we tried to put a lot more. We tried to increase the price of petrol so people get more fuel efficient cars or would walk more. What that happened was that it actually did nothing. So people thought they were doing good. It did nothing, and people started questioning, well, why are we doing all this when nothing's happened? And one of the reasons was we had Jevons paradox, and it was kind of that counterintuitive, as you were mentioning. As the cars were becoming more, petrol was becoming more cheaper, the manufacturers just made the cars more fuel efficient, so we just drove more. So we had that counterintuitive where we thought we were doing good, but actually the good started to, the bad started to outweigh the good, and therefore we hadn't really done anything.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the rebound effect is something that, we experience in many areas. There is kind of few, empirical studies that in some areas, rebound effect is not as dramatic, for example, in heating. That's interesting. So people do not, I mean, if you get more efficient heating systems, they're not pushing up the heat at 28 or degree or centigrade or something. So apparently they feel comfortable with 22, and if you get it more efficient, they still have less fuel. But in transportation, we have a strong rebound effect. And that, of course, is something that, is difficult to address. We think transportation is, one of the most difficult things to do because people are getting so used to using cars. And even if they, during the pandemics, they used even more cars, but they're also just, stayed home and did home office and other things. But as soon as the pandemic was over, they didn't go back to public transportation, at least not to an extent that they had done it before. So yeah, that's a big challenge, and you can have monetary incentives, which UK did, which of course other countries did. Or you can trying to ban cars from streets like in London. But overall, we can see that the progress is very slow. And I'm not quite sure we have a very good answer to this. I mean, one of the things that we are trying now in Germany to say, okay, well, again, make people do all transportation within 5 miles, either by bicycle or by foot or by public transportation, which would mean a lot because whatever 30 or 40% of all transportation within 5 miles. But you cannot order it. And again, to be persuasive is difficult. And as you mentioned, I mean, the global climate crisis is seen as something that happens somewhere else. So locally, people say, "Oh yeah, I think climate has changed, but it doesn't really affect me." And even these big events like a big flood, I mean, it affects 2,000, 3,000 people, and everybody is upset about it. But it's not big enough to say, "Okay, it may affect me." Or the people that I know. So it's too bad that these people, are being affected, and those are the bad companies and so on. So we can also put the blame on somebody else, and then nothing changes. And I think, again, it comes back to what I've said about narratives of how to put people, each individual, into the narrative and saying, okay, well, this is the kind of agency you have. I think that's the other thing. A lot of people say, oh, I can't do anything about it anyway. I mean, that is beyond me. And then we have this issue of marginality. You say, well, my impact is so small, well, why should I bother? And so on. So that all adds on to the excuses of not being part of the solution. And again, I think putting it into narrative and saying, okay, yes, well, your part is very, very minor. However, if 10,000 of people do the same thing, then it gets really it has an impact, and so all the individuals add up, and we have to make it really plausible to people that works. But I agree, we have a lot of examples also in Germany where, we had a lot of good efforts in communication, also policy making. And, because of the rebound effect, it didn't work. I don't know, if you're still there, maybe you can say something about Japan and China, if they were more successful in, persuading people to do some action for protecting the climate.
We have many cases, and I think in China is more special because most of the policy, they are top down. So in this sense, the government actually they do not spend many efforts to persuade people to do some particular policy. They design the policy, and then the community will follow the policy because it's a top-down manner. And in Japan, I think it's more bottom up in some sense. So the governments and also the researchers, they spend a lot of efforts to help the community to aware the risk. So after they have the awareness of the risk, it's easier for them to respond and react to risk actions. Yes.
Well, that's interesting discussion of the communication is how it affected, as you mentioned, the rebound effects on that. And especially, I want to go back again to tipping points, because like, as you mentioned, we know that perhaps not everyone's share in their mind of the tipping points that we want to communicate to them. So how to communicate effectively that perhaps people have different tipping points in their mind? Should we make them think similarly in everyone as in general, or we consider its individual narrative, and then we shape the communication structures based on that? Or what should we do if, in regards of the individual perspective on crisis and systemic risk?
Well, I think, you're probably right. I mean, very often we know that there are maybe tipping points or tipping areas, but we don't know exactly where they are. And so that makes it more difficult. And sometimes, we have conventions that are saying, okay, we don't want to get beyond whatever 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5 or 2.5 and so on, knowing that, there's not a border. We say 2.49 is fine, 2.51 is bad, so in that sense, these are our conventions. Nevertheless, we know it's there are kind of tipping areas where things go suddenly from the good to the bad, or from the bad to the worse. And I think one of the things that, at least in Europe, has become, at least politically popular as a precautionary principle, where you say, okay, even if I don't know exactly where the line is, we want to be precautious and not get even closer to the line, because otherwise we may have a real detrimental impact. The other one is to say, well, even if you don't know the tipping point, but we're trying to do something that has also other co-benefits. And that, I think, is a very good way of proceeding. So say, okay, well, if you go, let's say, from fossil fuel to renewable energies, we may really reduce the probability that we hit a tipping point. But in addition, it's also very good for your health, because burning coal has very major impacts on public health. It may also give you a more sovereignty in your country, because the solar panels are in the country and not you don't have to import everything. So trying to have no regret measures is a very good thing to deal with this, because you can say, okay, even if it doesn't help to avoid tipping points, or if you are still far away from a tipping point, or even if those benefits that we have looked for come much later. I mean, that's the other problem with climate change. I mean, the CO2 remains in the atmosphere 75 or even more years. So even if you cut down all the CO2 emission at once, we still would have the same problems for a couple of decades. And that, of course, nobody wants to wait that long. So you need to stress the co-benefits. I think that's a very important element. And I'm glad you mentioned it, to say, okay, well, if we do this, we have some immediate benefits that go beyond what the climate is. And if you can design methods that have a lot of co-benefits, I think that can help a lot. And we can see it in a lot of communication projects that we have done in areas where we had a lot of people who don't believe in climate change. We said, okay, well, you have now home energy. This is energy that comes in your community, and you can control it. And then they said, oh, well, that's great. We want to have that. And then you come back to solar energy, and you say, okay, is there an additional benefit, even if you don't believe in climate change, but there may be still a chance that it is there. And you hit that chance too. So I think is kind of an important element to think about, no regret measures, and specifically co-benefits. And I mean, in some areas, just put the co-benefits in front and not the benefits.
Yeah, and actually, when you talk about the way that they're trying to use to persuade, and in the UK, one of the things that we've done is to get people on board. And this is kind of a surprise from a centre-left government that we have currently, is to use very nationalistic tones that appeal, obviously, to groups that they wouldn't normally appeal with. So some of the slogans that that we use now is "Power Britain with clean energy," "Make Britain energy independent," "Grown in Britain." It's that Britain tagline that is getting used quite often now as a nationalistic, which is more to the right, a voter, to actually, and they are crossing a boundary using that. And actually, you talk about preventing the polycrisis, and using that communication to nudge people towards preventing it. but it's a double-edged sword, I always find as well, because, and this is something that in my research I've seen before, is that when you do prevent one, you kind of lose the trust to prevent another one. So the one I think of is the ozone and acid rain. So we did really good job of banning CFCs and preventing the ozone layer from getting bigger, and actually it's now starting to repair itself. But now when we get to the climate crisis, people say, well, you talked about the ozone layer in the 1980s, that didn't happen. So how do you know that this is really a big issue as well? So for me, it's always been it's a very fine, like, tightrope you're trying to walk to communicate stopping one crisis, but then it could have a cascading effect to trying to stop another crisis, because then you lose the trust of the public.
Yeah, I think, we call this is a prevention paradox. That if you're very good at preventing something, people say, why do we spend all the money and it didn't happen? And they say, well, we spent the money because of that money being spent, it didn't happen. And that's sometimes very difficult to communicate, because people think, okay, maybe there wasn't a crisis and it was just being invented. So in that sense, yes, you're right. I think, again, communication there, I think with the ozone layer was also to make sure that people, in a sense, maybe overstated, congratulate themselves for having made that crisis disappear. And I think that's an important element, is to say also to have some very good feedback. I mean, they have whatever celebrations of saying, okay, look, guys, we didn't get into that trap, and we did have an impact on this. And very often we don't do this, because we go back to the next crisis, and then people feel that the old crisis, wasn't there, because it wasn't really communicated that we did something and it happened. And it's also very important to improve whatever the feeling of agency. I think, what you said about right-wing movement, we have it all over Europe, all over the world. And one of the main correlations that we can see is between, people believing in these right-wing movements and the feeling that they don't have agency. And that is a very strong correlation. People who feel that, their voice is not being heard, that they have no impact on policies, that they're being, just overlooked, that's the people who vote for right-wing parties. And so it's very important to say, oh, no, your action had an impact, and we need to have better feedback mechanisms. I know when I was living in the United States, we had a big display on the city hall saying, okay, this day we reduced our CO2 amount by whatever X%, and so on and so on. So people said, oh, wow, well, look, wouldn't that good, guys? No, it's went down, and we could put in newspapers or something. I think it's very important to get feedback, and if you get very good feedback on prevention, then people say, okay, well, my money made a difference, or my contribution made a difference. If you don't have that feedback, people feel it was wasted. And that, I think, is a very important element to do that. And also, we have a lot of people here in Germany, at least, that are very pessimistic about the future, and they become fatalists. And so we have one that denies and the other one that are fatalists, and both are not very good for dealing with the future. And you have to get the fatalists saying, look, guys, we have been successful in many things. Ozone layer, yes, it was a big challenge. Yeah, we did it. We had a lot of conventional risks. So we were very successful. And society can do a lot, but we need to address it, and we cannot ignore it, and we cannot just say, we'll let it go and we could see how we will deal with it when it's there. We can prevent things. And I think if that message is out and we get good feedback also on the measures, very often I think the impacts are much later, but we can say, oh, West, we reduce the CO2 level, look, and we can do it next day, we can do it even better. I think that kind of feedback is very important in terms of communication.
This, in relation to that, but a very simple one. It's bad feedback. It's will be give the similar consequences as no feedback, or just different consequences.
Well, I think that the feedback is very often should be related to what people have contributed. Either it's money, or it's behavioral change, or it's whatever it is, and that to say it had it did something that it promised to do. Now, very often we can see the effects immediately. I said that's what I mentioned before. And then I think you can say about what it did in terms of, output. I mean, you can say, oh, we did reduce the CO2 level, emissions. We did do X and Y and Z. And also to look, as I said, to co-benefits and say, oh, our air has become cleaner now. And our hospitals were saying that they had 10% less people coming with respiratory diseases. And so, you really saved 10% more people of having real big health impacts, and maybe have those people go in the newspapers and saying, thank you, citizens, our daughter had whatever asthma and now she's much better because of the better health care that we have now. And then people feel good. I mean, you say, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, this little girl there, and now she's much happier than before. One person can make a big difference. And so I think these kinds of communications, showing the co-benefits immediately, and then also showing what a significant reduction you have made in terms of climate change. If you combine both, I think then the communication can succeed.
Absolutely. And it's one of them things as well, is that when we tried, I'm going to keep coming back to the climate crisis because it's the one I work on the most. Is it how it's one of them communication things? How do you reach to the group that don't want to be reached? So those who, are complete denialist, fatalist, even nihilist, whatever you want to call them. What can you communicate to get to them? So as you mentioned about the clean air, the likelihood is that they are actually concerned about that issue. So if you say, oh, by having this electric car, the air's cleaner, then you get to them. And then the idea is that actually the knock-on effect is going to be you're actually helping the climate crisis, but you don't mention that to that group. You just say, you completely just ignore that. But to the other groups, you would say that. And it's actually, I think sometimes that's what you need to do is that, individual messaging and communication to groups who do not, have different ideologies. Because if you try to do, and it's one of the things I think we've done pretty poorly historically, is we've had one message and we've treated the communities as homogenous in terms of we all have the same belief, we all have the same ideology. That's not the case, and we need to be very specific on how we target different groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I think framing is a really important element in terms of this. And we've been also using, you mentioned it before, using maybe some semantic frames from the far right to get a message across that is also pro-environment. So to saying, yes, this is domestic energy that we're talking about. This is, even we talk about home energy or native energy. And I know it's a slippery road because, on one hand, then the right-wing party can say, we do it better than you. But at the same time, I think if we talk to citizens in communities and saying, okay, maybe you're not concerned about climate change, but, again, talking about this co-benefits or talking about, other things that matters to them. And what we always do is to say, look, guys, even if you don't believe in climate change, you still be, the glaciers are melting and so on. Even if we don't know exactly what's coming from, but it also helps if there is a climate crisis. And that, I think, was very successful, at least in lots of terms. We used that kind of rhetoric to say, people said, yeah, well, we don't believe in it, but no, we want to be on the safe side, again. But if you don't have the co-benefits, and if you don't say those are the main reasons, we want to have healthy kids here. We want to clean the air. We want to make sure that we have energy security. We want to have more sovereignty here. That, of course, people say, yeah, we do want that. That's exactly what we want. And I said, and in addition, it's also good for climate change. They say, oh yeah, we don't care so much about it, but if it's also good for that, so what? And you can. So it's not like giving them food for the denial, but giving them food for approving the method, but still thinking, well, if there is something true with climate change, we still do something good here. and so there's a lot of this kind of ambiguity also, even in the denial groups, very often. Not the radical ones, because they, that's a different type of people, but the normal people that are believing the radical disinformation people, or tend to believe them, or want to be, part of the conspiracy groups, they still have a little doubt in the back of their head. Oh, is that really true, what I'm saying? And if they get this kind of double assurance, saying, okay, you do something what you feel is good, but at the same time, it may be also good for things that you not totally believe in, but you cannot exclude. Then I think, you can have a very positive feeling, and it's still not, let's say, deceiving your mission of climate control.
Now, talking about all these difficulties and challenges in assessment of the systemic risk and polycrisis, and then we talk very long on the how communication and communicating better to public, and even involve them to giving and getting the feedback of the policy that they contribute on. So what's the priority here for the systemic risk and polycrisis? What kind of research should be prioritized? We should be moving towards better communications on all the crises that come upon us, or better assessment on which point that the polycrisis will be proved.
Yeah, well, would you like to say what would you think is the priority in terms of future research and future management?
From my opinion, I think it's very difficult to say which should be prioritized. I think all of them should go together. We should develop the good or appropriate tools and techniques to assess the risk, and also we should help to design the policy to govern the risk, and also it's very important to communicate those to the public. So from my opinion, I think we should the 3 dimensions we should all spend efforts into the 3 dimensions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would definitely support this. I mean, one alone doesn't help. So what we need is better assessment methods, so that we can see what is happening to us and what we can face. Secondly, we need better management and governance methods, so that people also get trust in the institutions that deal with it. And thirdly, we need better communication, as we said, because there are a lot of challenges, and that even the best management method would not get public support if you don't have the right communication behind it. So we need basically a package between all 3. I know that seems trivial on the first glance, but nevertheless, I think that's very often not being done. Now we see that a lot of people are working now on better assessment methods and don't care about how that means or what that means for management. And we need people that are trying to get that kind of cross-sectoral management done, but don't look into how to communicate this. And so I think a joint effort to be, making assessment methods a link with management and governance methods, and not being associated with the appropriate communication methods, that's what's needed. And we need all 3 elements.
Yeah, so when you were writing this paper, and you think about personal insights, and what personal insights or surprises came out of this paper?
Yeah, well, would you like to start?
Yes. Personally, I think the most surprise came out is like, personally, I also aware not only the theory but also practice should be pay attention, because the future research must bridge theory and practice by producing actionable insights through the close cooperation between multiple stakeholders, ensuring like we have both academic and real world impact. That's from my personal insights.
Yeah, I think that's the one of the things. I think we both were experiencing that we saw a lot of would say gaps. The gaps between assessment management and communication. They seem to be distinct from each other and not really linked. We also saw that what we had discussed before, that the different management agencies were not cooperating, and that there was a strong impulse to optimize each risk section separately. And thirdly, I think also that this gap between academic research and practical implementation, where we could see that a lot of academics were talking about polycrisis as Huan was talking before, even a decade ago, but nobody really took it up. And so it's very important to see that whatever is academically done has an impact on the practical operational world, and the other way around. I mean, we often see that, some people, some communities have done this kind of cooperating between sectors, also maybe for decades, but never communicated about it. And then, it was a singular event and not something that, had widespread use in different communities in different countries.
So based on this works and the papers from both of you, what is the next step for both of you or either of you, whether collaboration in the future will be happen again on your work in this polycrisis systemic risk? Is there any plan already that can be shared with us?
Yeah, I think that the topic will not go away. And as you said, we have a lot of unfinished business here. And so we're very happy to, to go beyond, just having one paper. One paper is good. We're going to have this special issue of the journal that comes out in August this year. So that's great. And there are other very good authors that have looked into polycrisis and systemic risks. And there are other communities. I mean, there's a big international community called ASRA, which is for systemic risk assessment. And they are trying to deal with the issue, and UN agencies and so on. So I think, yes, there's now some more sensitivity to the issue. And, and I think Huan and I will be very happy to contribute to this also in the future.
Okay, and lastly, any final advice for crisis managers, scholars, or even concerned citizens?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so from my opinion, I think we should not think isolated, and as all our discussions earlier, like today's crisis, including climate, health, economic, or technological, are all interconnected and fast moving. So we should think connected and embrace cooperative thinking. And also we should maybe share data or inclusive decision making. So for scholars, crisis managers, and community members, we should combine the local knowledge with scientific evidence. So don't think isolated. That's my opinion. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And we could put it in two different sentences. The first one is no crisis is an island. And so all these things are interconnected, and we can say the second one, each crisis is an iceberg. So what you see above the river or above the sea level is only a third of what is actually the whole amount of the crisis and its impact potential. So I think if you have those two, let's say, figurative ideas, it's not an island and it is an iceberg, then I think that can help you to deal prudently with future crises.
So I guess that's it. We discussed a lot on all the concepts, the history of both the systemic and polycrisis, some examples, old examples, new examples, and the challenges in the assessment and communications. So that was very enlightening discussions. We thank you both, Professor Renn and Dr. Liu, for the opportunity to come to us. Any messages to our listener, last messages. Either
Well,
both of you.
we would like to thank you, of course, also for being very, very good interview partners. I mean, you've basically made it very come alive here, and we all hope that specifically for you, as younger people, that you will live up in a world in which we can cope with polycrisis, and that we all have the opportunity and that we can contribute to really having a better means to deal with polycrisis, because yes, we want to have a good future.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, and it's really an honor to have the opportunity to share our paper through the podcast. Thank you very much.
So that's it, everyone. As a reminder, you can find the paper in the International Journal of Disaster Reductions with, you just can search the names of either authors, or you can just search the title called The Polycrisis and Systemic Risk Assessment, Governance, and Communications. That's it, everyone. Thank you for listening. Until next time.